without further delay, I'm going to now invite and welcome our final speaker for this morning, Dr. Nicole Brown, who is the head of Research Ethics and Integrity at the Institute of Education. I'm really pleased to have Nicole here this morning, and Nicole bring a different, interesting perspective, disciplinary perspective from the social sciences on ethics in a changing social science landscape. So over to you, Nicole.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So thank you very much again for having invited me, Professor Heinrich and Professor Wang, to talk to you today. I'm just putting this up there. If anybody is out there on Twitter, please do tweet as well. This is me. And what I'm going to be talking about today is really giving you a little bit of a background and context, first of all. But then I will be talking about the changing social sciences landscape, the impact on research ethics, and future-proofing research ethics processes. So the reason I'm starting this is, I mean, I have actually written a paper on this, so this is already currently under review. But the reason why I've invited to this is because I have kind of voiced my skepticism, let's put it that way, regarding the role of research ethics committees. We all know that research ethics committees are not there to stop research from happening. They are there to support research, but to support research in an ethical way. However, in that respect, we are safeguarding the researchers, we are safeguarding the participants, but we are in a way safeguarding the institutions as well. And that's one of the criticisms that I am known for, because I do think that we have to make sure that we get the balance right. And in addition to that, I always say that there are certain things that have changed in the social sciences particular, so that we actually have to account for that in our research ethics processes. So just to say, to start off with, this practitioner researcher in an independent researcher role, that's something that I am, advocating for, and I'm doing a lot of work around that. The British Educational Research Association has reviewed the 4th edition of their guidelines, and I was on their working group, especially with a view of looking at the guidelines in that respect. So I am going to be talking today about research ethics in the social sciences, but like Professor Rees said earlier in the welcoming notes, you don't have to look far to see issues. I'm not going to be talking about the everyday thing. The conference theme was about the frontier, so I'm going to try and push the boundaries a bit further. And potentially, I'm going to raise some more skepticism that I haven't perhaps raised in a public realm before, but I do hope that it will give food for thought. So what is it that's changing the social sciences landscape? Well, first of all, we all know that our doctoral students in particular have to look at originality and have to provide innovation. This need for innovation and originality has actually pushed our research methods in the social sciences particularly. So there are now ways of looking at inclusive practices and participatory approaches, a lot of them with creative methods, where we are certainly not just asking people for an interview, but we are actually asking them to provide photographs, to get involved in workshops. So all of those things have emerged in the recent sort of decade, which hadn't been before. The other thing that we are noticing is obviously the casualization and the precarious contracts. We can't ignore that these things are there. They are there and they have an impact. The impact that they have got is that a lot of people have to make sure that CVs are even stronger because they are competing in a more competitive environment. So again, there is this need for creating something new, for innovation, for originality. The gig economy was already there before the pandemic, but obviously the pandemic has highlighted certain ways of working that actually undermine or undervalue particular labor force. And again, the people with the precarious contracts, and largely it tends to be people from minority backgrounds, women and disabled staff, they are, in that kind of, even more difficult situation that they have to counteract that. So what we notice really is two particular trends in the social sciences. On the one hand, the methodological approaches to push for originality leads to an increase of participatory, egalitarian, co-constructed research approaches. On the other hand, all of those things that I mentioned about the precarious contract leads to a rise of an independent research agenda. Even when people are not within an employment, they still do the research because they have to make sure that they continue to be competitive. So they research in an independent environment. And that's obviously having an impact on the ethics. A lot of the time, that impact on the ethics is perhaps not noted quite as formally or as explicitly as I'm doing it now. The impact of the participatory, egalitarian, co-constructed research first. If we're looking at trying to do something with our participants, involving them and really handing over responsibility and power, it means that our processes are actually in collaboration with the participants. The consequence of that is that we don't necessarily know what we're going to do until we've actually done it already. So it's that process of that dynamism that's really quite an important aspect of participatory and egalitarian and co-constructed research. But obviously it totally opposes that kind of one-point snapshot of an ethical approval form. I want to raise two examples. And I'm not sure whether both of them are in the audience today. It wasn't planned that way. But I would like to raise the work of Sarah Young and Alison Finch, which is not unusual at all in the sense that it is really working with research, with participants, collaborating with young adults most of the time. And it's that kind of work that is really pushing the boundaries methodologically. And obviously, as a consequence, also in the knowledge production. But what does it mean ethically? There's the kind of idea now, well, if they are participants, are they co-researchers or still just participants? Or are they actually researchers? In Alison's case, Alison actually trained young adults to interview their peers. So they're no longer just co-researchers, they're effectively researchers. And that boundary is something that's really difficult to navigate. The anonymity and confidentiality are obviously issues, and I'm not going into sort of more detail about that. But I do want to mention those in the context of giving voice. Sarah's work in particular is talking about, giving voice to young adults with different kinds of identities. Well, anonymity is a problem here because yes, okay, we do want to protect the participants. We want to keep their work anonymous and confidential. But do we have a right to do that? Who gets to decide whether we're allowed or not allowed to give that voice? The next thing is the researcher's responsibility to do no harm. I absolutely advocate that. And I have written a paper about how creative methods are often overlooking that aspect because they are sort of handing over the responsibility to the participants, but the participants don't necessarily know what they let themselves in for. So yes, the researcher has to continue having a control over the entire process. But at the same time, how can I decide what harm I am doing or not doing by not giving that voice? And that's something that we have to also consider. Now, what's the impact of the independent research agendas? As we all know, approvals are usually granted in higher education institutions. That means you do need to have some kind of affiliation. It's in the UK context, it's practically impossible as an independent researcher to get any kind of ethical approval. Yes, you can apply all sorts of different social guidelines. I mean, the Social Research Association, the American Psychological Association, BPS, BERA, all of them have got codes of conduct and guidelines, but they don't offer any opportunity to get ethical approval. So it's not quite the same thing. Because what happens is that practitioners and independent researchers in particular become unrecognized in that system. When you try to publish, a lot of the publishing companies nowadays ask, and under which number was this authorized and approved? Well, if you're an independent researcher, you don't have any affiliation with any university, it's going to be really difficult to argue that case. And it becomes more and more difficult. An example for that also is that kind of independent research agenda is that people start to revalue what actually constitutes research. So I'm working a lot with charities and councils and independent organizations, for example, the Mental Health Foundation, Photo Voice Worldwide, and all of them are doing some form of research under the umbrella of service evaluation. Now, service evaluation or those kinds of user evaluation sort of sits within the feedback category and therefore doesn't constitute formal research in many cases. So they argue, but do they really? And that's the point that I'm trying to make here, is that actually, you know, there is an issue here with funders funding particular kinds of research, but actually not funding some other things with the independent councils and charities are trying to pursue. So again, we've got this kind of fluctuating dynamic research context and setting that we're working with or against. So let me move on to future-proofing the research ethics processes. I mean, first of all, obviously, you know, I'm, as you may have already noticed, I'm advocating that we all support independent researchers and charities, and we have to do that via external approvals, and I'm coming back to that in a second. There's also this element of different approvals, different types of approvals we need to consider. And the final point is the attitudinal shift regarding the role of the ethics committees. So let me move into a little bit more detail on each of these points. The first part is supporting others via external approvals. It exists, just not in the UK. In New Zealand, there is a non-profit charity called New Zealand Ethics, where people can apply, anybody can apply, and have their project reviewed, and they get an approval number just as any other person would from a higher education institution. Publishing companies recognize that. The issue that we've got here is obviously that this is a charity that has to be funded somehow. So obviously they are asking for money. Independent researchers may not necessarily have the funds for that. So that's an issue that has to be overcome as well. So it's not quite as simple as let's just establish a research ethics committee that supports those people. We actually have to throw some funds behind that as well. Personally, I think it should be publishing companies as well as higher education institutions that are throwing some money behind those, and research funders that should be sort of providing that, because as I've said, the social sciences landscape is such that actually a large majority of people are excluded from research if we don't support them. What about the different types of approvals? Some institutions do have that approach of approvals in principle. That's quite important in the participatory realm, because that way you can gain approvals in principle before you're going out to develop the actual research question together with your participants. So that in some respect works. But it does rely on every single researcher to then come back off their own back to say, well, I'm now developing this into a full process. So obviously from an institutional point of view, there is this kind of danger that people may not come back. And that's something that we also have to kind of work on, which moves us into the third point about the attitudinal shift. So just hold that thought for a moment. The final different type of approval is really the retrospective ethical approvals. Retrospective ethics, I totally understand why we don't want to do that. We don't want to give retrospective approval for something that people have done without anybody having had a look at it beforehand. However, especially within the context of teaching and learning, where often things are happening and we then identify, oh, this is something that's really important, I need to pursue that. You're already halfway through the project, and then you realize you can't get the ethics approved because it would be a retrospective approval. And it's not just within teaching and learning context, it's also with any kind of practitioner context, so nurse, legal professions, any kind of practitioner-based inquiry is struggling with that kind of context, that you're actually halfway through something when you notice that there is something worthwhile to pursue. So what does that mean, all of this? It leads us to the final kind of attitudinal shift. So first of all, we have to prioritize ethics, no longer seeing it as ticking boxes, and not just the ethics committees, but also each and every one of us as individuals. It's not about trying to please the institution or trying to follow procedures. It is about how we conduct our own research, and that we really have to prioritize it in that way. If all of us were to do research ethically in that sense, the institution would probably be a little bit happier, giving us all a little bit more leeway. But as long as there is, there are situations where the institution feels they can't give us that leeway, we will struggle with that. The other thing is, doing the research ethically versus the institutional protection. I've kind of already hinted on that, hinted to that when we were talking about prioritizing ethics. And the final thing, and that's for me the most important part, is that within prioritizing ethics, we have to start seeing ethics reviews as roles, as things that people do for pay, as people allocated time for it. We cannot ask for voluntary contributions, because that house of cards on voluntary contributions and voluntary work is eventually going to collapse. So let's try and actually take a proactive step against that and start allocating time, money, and training and all whatever comes with it to that kind of process of prioritizing ethics, rather than seeing it as a tick box exercise. So I'm not sure whether I'm going to have upset a few people, but I hope you can see that it's in the best of interest to the researchers. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.